December 3, 1944. The Pacific swelled beneath a steel-gray sky, the horizon blurred where clouds met water, and a rusting U.S. Navy transport ship cut its way across the restless wave. On the deck, gathered in silence, stood a cluster of Japanese women, some in threadbare auxiliary uniforms, others wrapped in faded kimonos hastily carried from ruined villages. Their eyes did not rest on the sea but on the boots of the American guards who watched them, rifles slung casually, as if this voyage were routine rather than extraordinary. For the women, every moment was weighted with dread. They had been taught that capture was worse than death, that the enemy would strip them not only of freedom but of dignity, and that mercy was a foreign word. Yet here they were, alive, breathing salt air, wondering what form of cruelty awaited them in Hawaii. Among them was a nurse from Manila who had once stitched wounds by lantern light, her fingers steady even as bombs fell outside the hospital walls. She remembered her commander's last order, "Do not let yourself be taken." Beside her, a clerk from Guam clutched a rosary, its beads worn smooth, though she dared not show it openly. A younger woman, barely 20, whispered to an older one, "They will parade us through their streets. They will laugh at us." The older woman gave no reply. She had already buried too much faith in silence. The Americans, for their part, offered little conversation. They smoked cigarettes against the wind, pointed occasionally to the sky when a formation of B-24 bombers droned overhead, and exchanged jokes that the women could not understand. The guards seemed neither cruel nor sympathetic. Their indifference was, in its own way, unsettling. Fear had prepared the women for shouting, for strikes with the butt of a rifle, for humiliation. Instead, they were met with a strange quiet, one that left room for imagination to gnaw at them. The sea air carried smells unfamiliar: strong coffee from the mess, canned beef warming in metal tins, and tobacco drifting in gray streams. Compared to the rations they had known, rice stretched thin with barley husks, dried fish when luck allowed, the abundance was almost offensive. One woman muttered, "They feed even their soldiers like kings." Her voice was bitter, yet tinged with disbelief. It is worth remembering what December 1944 meant. The war in the Pacific was nearing its crescendo. American forces had returned to the Philippines, island by island, pushing back an empire that once seemed unstoppable. Casualties mounted on both sides, and for the Japanese, surrender remained unthinkable. Yet here, on this single transport ship, the unthinkable had occurred. Dozens of women, plucked from scattered outposts and field hospitals, had been taken prisoner. For them, capture was not only personal shame but also cultural disgrace. The words of the imperial rescript still echoed, "Death before dishonor." To return alive was to betray ancestors and emperor alike. That weight pressed hardest on the nurse. She stood at the railing, staring into the endless sea, and measured the distance between herself and the dark waves below. One leap could restore her honor. But as she leaned slightly, a guard's shadow fell beside her. He said nothing, only shifted his stance, resting his rifle casually against his shoulder. She realized then that even death was denied to her. She would live, whether she wished it or not. At night, the women slept in cramped quarters below deck, hammocks swaying with the ship's rhythm. The air was thick with oil, sweat, and salt. Some prayed in whispers. Others lay awake, rehearsing every story of American brutality they had been told. Rumors of women violated in Nanking, stories of civilians shot on beaches, tales of captives starved until their bones pierced skin. These circulated like smoke, impossible to grasp yet impossible to ignore. They braced themselves for degradation, convinced it would arrive the moment the ship docked. And yet, the Americans treated them as if they were fragile cargo rather than enemies. When one woman grew ill with fever, a medic brought aspirin and a blanket. When another stumbled on the deck, a guard caught her arm instead of letting her fall. Such gestures were not kindness in their minds but tricks, preludes to a harsher cruelty. Suspicion grew sharper with every small mercy. The ocean stretched on, and with it time for reflection. One young auxiliary thought of her brother, drafted at 19, who had written once from Saipan before vanishing into silence. Another remembered cheering crowds in Tokyo years earlier, when Babe Ruth toured Japan with American players, when baseball was hailed as a bridge between nations. She wondered now if those cheers had been a foolish dream. The voyage took days. Each sunrise brought fresh dread, for Hawaii was no longer a paradise in their minds but the doorstep of the enemy's heart. The guards spoke of Honolulu in casual tones, its bright markets, its beaches, its bars filled with sailors. The women listened, imagining themselves paraded before jeering crowds, mocked for their surrender. One whispered, "Better to be invisible." Another answered, "We will never be invisible again." As the ship neared Oahu, the skyline emerged, green ridges rising against blue sky, white spray crashing against volcanic cliff. The women pressed to the railing, silent. The land looked impossibly lush compared to the bomb-scorched islands they had left behind. Palm trees swayed gently, and smoke curled from chimneys of distant homes. To their eyes, it was a vision from another world, a place untouched by war. But the harbor told another story. Battleships moored in rows, scars of December 7th still visible at Pearl Harbor, where rusted hulks lay half-submerged as reminders of vengeance. The transport slowed. The guards ordered the women to line up, their voices firm but not harsh. Chains were not used. Ropes guided them instead. As they shuffled forward, each woman held her breath. They had braced for cruelty since the moment of capture. They expected spittle, fists, and laughter. The moment of truth had come. The gangway thudded against the pier, echoing like a final verdict. One by one, they descended, their sandals scraping against the wood. On the dock below stood rows of American soldiers, their uniforms pressed, their rifles polished. Behind them, civilians watched with curious eyes, some Hawaiian women carrying baskets of fruit, children peering around their mothers' skirts. No one spat. No one jeered. A silence heavier than insult stretched across the harbor. The nurse, clutching her thin blanket, dared a glance upward. She saw not hatred but curiosity in the soldier's eyes. One young GI, perhaps no older than her lost brother, leaned on his rifle with a faint, almost awkward smile, as if unsure how one should greet an enemy who looked so tired, so human. The women exchanged glances, confusion stirring where fear had ruled. This was not the reception they had prepared their hearts for. Something was wrong, or perhaps something was very right. As they were marched toward waiting trucks, one of the younger women whispered, "If this is mercy, what comes next?" And with that question, the silence of the harbor seemed to widen, as if holding its breath, waiting to reveal an answer none of them had imagined. The trucks rattled away from the harbor, their wooden sides creaking, the women clutching their bundles of clothes and blankets. Dust swirled in the warm Hawaiian air as they were driven inland, away from the sound of the sea. Palm trees flashed past, then sugar-cane fields, their sweet scent drifting through the slats. For some, it was the first time in years they smelled something not tinged by smoke or rot. Yet the sweetness only sharpened their unease. Beauty was not meant for captives. When the convoy reached the camp, the women braced for humiliation. Barbed wire gleamed in the sunlight, stretched in perfect rows. Watchtowers stood at the corners, their silhouettes like rigid exclamation marks. American flags rippled over the gate, the sound of their fabrics snapping against the breeze. The women clutched their shawls tighter. They had entered the belly of the enemy. Inside, however, the order was disarmingly tidy. Rows of wooden barracks stood in even lines, the ground swept of debris, paths carved neatly between. Soldiers moved with brisk efficiency, but not with menace. A sergeant barked instructions, his words translated haltingly by an interpreter. "You will be registered. You will be housed. You will receive rations. Follow rules and you will not be harmed." The bluntness of the promise startled them more than threats would have. Registration began. One by one, names were written, at least the fragments the women dared to give. Some gave false surnames, fearing their families back home would be shamed if their names appeared on American record. Others refused to speak, their silence a shield. The clerks, unbothered, simply marked them with numbers. Identity reduced to digits. Efficient, impersonal, strangely merciful. The barracks were rough but clean. Each woman was given a cot with a wool blanket, coarse yet warmer than anything they had owned in months. Soap was distributed, bars stamped with English lettering. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, they could wash away the grime of captivity. The scent of lye and lavender filled the air, stinging their noses, almost dizzying. One woman scrubbed her arms until her skin flushed pink, as if she could erase the war itself. Food was next. They lined up outside a mess hall, metal trays clutched awkwardly. Inside, cooks ladled out portions of stewed beef, bread rolls, and strong black coffee. The women stared at their trays in disbelief. Meat was rare in Japan by 1944, rationed to nearly nothing. Coffee was nearly mythical, its bitter aroma reminding them of whispered stories about Western decadence. Some hesitated to eat, fearing poison or trickery. But hunger triumphed. One bite, then another, and soon the hall filled with the strange quiet of captives eating like guests. Later, one woman would admit, "I hated myself for enjoying their food more than ours." The days took on a rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work details assigned sparingly, some in the kitchens, others mending uniforms. Guards walked the perimeters but seldom intruded inside the barracks. Rumors trickled in. American prisoners in Japanese camps were not so fortunate. Word of the Bataan Death March had already reached Hawaii. Even soldiers whispered about it. The contrast could not have been starker. Here, the captives lived. There, many had died. And yet, life inside the fence was not without its weight. Every letter home was censored. Every memory of freedom gnawed at them. To be alive but powerless was its own prison. The younger women grew restless, pacing the yard, whispering about escape even as they knew it was impossible. The older ones clung to silence, their eyes turned inward, rehearsing the shame they would carry if they ever returned to Japan. Small ironies filled their days. American soldiers sometimes walked past, whistling tunes on their way to the canteen. The melodies were jaunty, almost careless. One of the women recognized a fragment of "You Are My Sunshine," and found herself humming it later, horrified that an enemy song had lodged in her throat. Another saw a soldier polishing his boots until they gleamed, and whispered, "Even their leather shines brighter than ours." The guards, too, became less fearsome as faces became familiar. One was barely 20, freckles spread across his nose, who handed out rations with exaggerated formality, as though each bread roll were a medal. Another, a burly Midwesterner, told jokes in English that the women could not understand, but his laughter was infectious enough that even captives smothered smiles. These were not demons from propaganda posters. They were boys with accents and quirks. That recognition unsettled the women more than cruelty would have. One afternoon, a medic checked on them, noting weights and temperatures. "Too thin," he muttered, shaking his head. He scribbled notes about calories, then turned to the guards. "Get them more milk." The women exchanged glances. Milk? It was a rarity even before the war. Now it was handed to them in tall glasses, cold and foreign. Some gagged at the richness, but others drank greedily, feeling strength seep into bones they thought hollowed forever. Letters from Japan haunted them. When permitted to write, their words were clipped by censors, stripped of despair or detail. Still, they imagined their families reading those sterile lines, knowing between the words lay dishonor. In Japanese eyes they were already dead. Yet here they lived, cared for by the enemy. The paradox pressed heavily, a weight more suffocating than wire or guard towers. At night, the women gathered quietly. Some shared memories of home, describing festivals lit by lanterns, kimonos of silk, the sound of shamisen drifting across narrow street. Others whispered of lost brothers or husbands. The nurse spoke of a boy she once treated, whose last words had been, "Tell my mother I was brave." She had promised, but now she was unsure if she would ever see Japan again. One evening, while the guards played cards near the gate, the women heard laughter erupt from the far side of the camp. It was loud, carefree, utterly out of place. They rose from their cots and peered through cracks in the barracks wall. Soldiers were gathered in a loose circle, shouting encouragement. A ball arced high into the sky, caught in the fading light, before slamming into a glove with a snap that carried across the yard. Dust rose as boots skidded on the makeshift field. The women froze. Baseball. The sound was unmistakable. In Japan, they had cheered games before the war, filled stadiums with roars for the Yomiuri Giants or the Hanshin Tigers. Now, here, the enemy played with a skill and ease that felt both familiar and alien. A young prisoner whispered, "They play our game." Another corrected, "No, they play it better." The laughter continued, mingling with the crack of bats, the thud of balls, the rhythm of a sport shared yet divided by war. The women pressed closer, eyes wide, hearts conflicted. For years, they had been taught the enemy was crude, uncivilized. But here, in the dust of a camp, the enemy played beautifully. And as the night deepened, one thought began to stir among them, fragile but insistent. If even a game could cross the lines of hatred, what else might the war have hidden from them? The first time the women saw the game in full daylight, it felt like stepping into a memory and a betrayal at once. The sun blazed over the camp yard, casting sharp shadows across the dust. Barbed wire hemmed the space, but inside the fences, American soldiers had cleared a rough diamond, marked with chalk lines stolen from the supply shed. Crude bases were hammered into the ground. A pitcher wound his arm in wide arcs, loosening his shoulder, while others clapped and jeered in good humor. The crack of the bat split the air, echoing like a rifle shot, and the ball soared high, vanishing briefly against the brightness before plummeting into a glove with a sharp slap. The women froze where they stood, trays still in their hands from the mess line. Baseball. Not in a stadium, not with uniforms, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It had been theirs too once. In the 1930s, Tokyo's Meiji Jingu Stadium had filled with cheering fans. Schoolboys across Japan dreamed of playing for the Koshien tournament, the pinnacle of high school pride. And now, here, the enemy claimed the same joy, the same skill, as if mocking them. One of the older auxiliaries whispered, "They took even this from us." Yet another, younger, whispered back with awe, "No, they make it alive." The players laughed as they moved, their bodies quick with ease. A runner slid into second, dust exploding around him, while the baseman tagged him with practiced grace. The women could not help but murmur, commentary spilling from lips that had not dared speak freely in weeks. Safe. Out. Good arm. Words they thought they had left behind in stadiums now buried under rubble. One soldier noticed their watching eyes and grinned. He lifted the ball, tossed it in his palm, then hurled it across the field with casual speed. The women gasped. The ball cut the air like a bullet. The throw was too fast, too clean. Some had seen Japanese school champions play before the war, but never had they witnessed power like this. The myth of the clumsy barbarian enemy cracked with every pitch. What made it worse, or better, was the joy. The men shouted nicknames, argued with mock anger over strikes and fouls, and slapped each other's backs with laughter that rolled like music. The sound unsettled the women more than anger could. Laughter was familiar, human, and it should not have belonged to the enemy. One young nurse clutched her hands together, torn between admiration and resentment. She remembered being a girl in Osaka, watching her brother field grounders with the same quick steps, the same shouts of triumph. He had gone to war in Manchuria and never returned. She stared at these men and saw his ghost, alive, laughing, whole. Tears burned her eyes, but she would not let them fall. History itself seemed to mock the irony. Baseball had been introduced to Japan in 1872 by an American teacher, Horace Wilson. By the 1920s, it was Japan's most beloved sport, a symbol of modern identity, a game that bridged East and West. In 1934, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig had toured Tokyo, drawing hundreds of thousands of fans who roared their approval. For a brief time, baseball was celebrated as proof that two nations could share not only commerce but culture. And then came Pearl Harbor, and the bridge was burned in flames. Now, under the Hawaiian sun, the game lived again, inside a prison camp, between captors and captives. One of the clerks turned to the others and whispered bitterly, "They play like gods. Did we ever truly own this game?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with shame. Another answered quietly, "Perhaps we never owned it. Perhaps it owns us." That afternoon, curiosity overcame fear. When the soldiers paused for water, a few women lingered near the fence. The Americans noticed and, with exaggerated bravado, began to show off, one pitching curveballs that bent like serpents, another catching them with bare hands, wincing theatrically at the sting. The women could not help but laugh, quickly covering their mouths in horror at the sound. The guards raised their brows in surprise but said nothing. For the first time since captivity began, laughter had broken through the wire. The tension between pride and wonder only deepened. To admit admiration was to betray everything they had been taught. To deny it was to lie to their own eyes. A few turned away, muttering that the enemy could not be allowed dignity. Yet most stayed, watching until the game ended, until the men tossed their gloves aside and ambled off, wiping sweat from their brows. That night, in the barracks, the women whispered about what they had seen. Some repeated the names of Japanese teams, the Yomiuri Giants, the Hanshin Tigers, like charms, as if invoking them could reclaim the game from American hands. One woman remembered the voice of Eiji Sawamura, the Japanese pitcher who once struck out Ruth, Gehrig, and Fox in succession. "We too had champions," she whispered half to herself. Yet Sawamura was dead now, lost at sea in 1944 when his transport was torpedoed. His victory was history. The living skill belonged to the enemy. The conflict was not only cultural but personal. Baseball was a memory of brothers, sons, and summers long gone. To see it played so well by those who might have killed their families was unbearable. Yet it was also irresistible. The bat cracked, the ball soared, and in that moment, the women were not prisoners but spectators again, girls in the stands, hearts leaping with the arc of the ball. Days passed, and the games continued. The soldiers played after drills, their shouts carrying over the camp. The women learned to anticipate the sound, gathering at the fence to watch discreetly. Some offered hushed commentary, others simply stared. The younger ones began to mimic the motions in secret, fingers curling as if gripping a ball, arms swinging in invisible arcs. In their mimicry was longing, and in their longing was danger, a recognition of shared humanity. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a foul ball bounced close to the women's side of the fence. Dust puffed as it rolled. For a moment no one moved. Then one young GI jogged over, tipping his cap. He bent, scooped it up, and, on impulse, tossed it gently underhand through a gap in the wire. Gasps rippled among the women. The ball thudded softly at their feet. No one dared touch it. It was both gift and challenge. Finally, the nurse bent, picked it up, and held it in her hands. The leather was warm from the sun, the stitches rough against her skin. She remembered the feel from years ago. Her brother's ball passed to her in secret. For a moment, her breath caught. Then the guard motioned lightly, "Toss it back." With trembling hands, she did. The ball sailed awkwardly, but he caught it and grinned. The exchange lasted seconds, but its weight lingered. The women looked at one another with eyes wide, as if they had just touched something forbidden. In a way, they had touched the humanity of the enemy. That night, silence filled the barrack. Some lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between guilt and wonder. Others dreamed of games they once watched, of cheers rising in stadiums before war had taught them to hate. The conflict inside their hearts grew sharper than the wire outside the fence. And as another day dawned, with the promise of another game, the women could not help but wonder what would happen if the lines blurred further. If the ball could pass through the fence again, what else might cross with it? The memory of the ball passed through the fence lingered like a ghost in the women's hands long after it had returned to the Americans. It was not just a sphere of leather and stitches but a spark, a reminder that even in war gestures could cross boundaries that propaganda and politics had drawn in blood. From then on, every game carried a new weight. The women no longer watched only with suspicion or envy, they watched with a dangerous tenderness, as if seeing fragments of themselves reflected back. The nurse, who once thought of hurling herself into the sea, now found her eyes fixed on the diamond whenever the soldiers played. The laughter that rose from the field no longer wounded her pride in the same way. Instead, it reminded her of summer evenings in Osaka, her brother's cap askew, the air filled with cicadas as he practiced pitching until the light failed. He had vanished into the maw of war, yet here, in the sunlit dust of Hawaii, his shadow seemed alive again. The recognition did not erase grief, but it softened its edges. For others the shift came more grudgingly. The clerk with the rosary still muttered that admiration was betrayal, but even she could not stop glancing through the fence. When one soldier hit a towering fly ball that seemed to scrape the very clouds, her mouth fell open before she could school her features. She crossed herself in secret afterward, as if to ask forgiveness for a moment of awe. The irony deepened when they realized the soldiers themselves were aware of their audience. The games grew sharper, more competitive, as if the Americans sensed they were being measured not just by teammates but by eyes trained to hate them. Curveballs snapped harder, swings cracked louder, and catches were made with flair. The diamond became a stage where performance doubled as persuasion. Perhaps unconsciously, the soldiers were showing the women not just how well they played, but how fully they lived. In those weeks, the women began to murmur about the contradictions pressing in on them. They had been taught the enemy was brutal, yet here were medics handing them milk. They had been told Americans were uncultured, yet here they were playing a game with elegance and speed. They had been warned they would be treated worse than animals, yet here they were given soap, blankets, and space to breathe. The propaganda crumbled one small mercy at a time. History bears out this paradox. By 1945, the United States had over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war in camps across its territory. Despite shortages, most were given rations equivalent to American soldiers' portions, a deliberate adherence to the Geneva Conventions. In contrast, of the 27,000 Americans captured by Japan, more than a third would not survive. For the Japanese women in Hawaii, this contrast was never spoken aloud but lived every day in the meals, the order, the games played before their eyes. They were meant to feel humiliation. Instead, they felt confusion. One evening, as twilight wrapped the camp, the younger women gathered near the fence. The Americans had finished their game, but the dust still hung in the air, glowing gold in the last rays. One of the nurses whispered, "Do you think they hate us?" Another shook her head slowly. "If they did, why would they play in front of us?" Silence followed. The thought was too heavy to carry further. Slowly, the fence itself changed meaning. Once it had been a symbol of division, iron teeth that defined conqueror and conquered. Now it became a frame through which the women watched humanity performed in unexpected ways. The soldiers' laughter, the way they patted dust from their uniforms, even the way they argued over strikes and fouls, it all became a language of life, one the women were reluctant yet compelled to learn. Beyond the camp, history was accelerating. The Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe. In the Pacific, Okinawa loomed. Casualties would climb higher still. But inside the barbed wire of Hawaii, another battle was quietly being waged, not of guns and shells, but of perception, of what it meant to see the enemy as human. Months later, when the war ended and the women were repatriated, some carried fragments of that transformation with them. Japan lay in ruins, cities flattened, families scattered. Amid the rubble, baseball survived. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the occupation, encouraged the sport as a bridge between the occupiers and the occupied. In 1949, when American teams toured Tokyo, crowds filled stadiums again, roaring with the same joy that once echoed from behind the fences of Hawaii. Baseball became more than a game. It became a vessel of reconciliation. One of the Hawaiian prisoners, interviewed years later, spoke in halting English. "I thought they would kill us. Instead they played. I hated them. But the sound of the bat," she paused, searching for words. "The sound stayed with me. It was like hearing my brother again." Her testimony was not isolated. Memories of small mercies, of unexpected humanity, became part of how captivity was remembered, fragile but enduring. The legacy of those encounters did not erase the brutality of the wider war. The women still carried scars of fear, of shame, of loss. But the image of young Americans laughing in the sun remained a paradox they could not banish. In the same way, when Japanese baseball flourished in the post-war years, when stadiums filled with fans cheering for Shigeo Nagashima or Sadaharu Oh, it was impossible not to recall that baseball's resilience was tied, however ironically, to the very enemy who had once wielded it as a symbol of vitality. For the nurse, the memory was sharper still. She kept a scrap of paper hidden for years, upon which she had drawn the outline of a baseball diamond from memory: 4 bases, a pitcher's mound, a fence. On the back she wrote 3 words in Japanese: "We watch them." She never explained it to her children, but when asked she would smile faintly and say, "It was the day I learned the enemy was not only enemy." The story circles back to a strange irony. A war defined by cruelty and destruction left, in this hidden corner, a memory of shared humanity carried on the arc of a ball. The women entered Hawaii expecting humiliation. Instead, they found confusion, even grudging respect. Baseball had survived bombs, propaganda, and fences. It had revealed a truth both unsettling and healing, that enemies could be mirrors, and that even in war, joy could break through wire. As the women left the camp months later, boarded onto ships bound for a ruined homeland, some glanced back at the diamond. It was empty, only dust and trampled chalk lines remaining. Yet in their minds, they still heard the crack of the bat, the laughter rolling across the yard. That sound would travel with them across the ocean, louder than speeches, sharper than slogans. It was proof that the world was larger, stranger, and more connected than they had been taught. And decades later, when Japanese players stood on American fields, cheered by thousands, some of those women, now old, would watch on small televisions and whisper, "We saw this long ago," before anyone else believed. The ball that passed through the fence had not just crossed wire, it had crossed time.